Oh boy, what do we have to do today?
Was Jesus a socialist?
Oh, well, if it's PragerU, I can already smell the lack of nuance from here. This video was brought to you by the wonderful people on screen here who support me over at Patreon. If you want to support this channel and what I do, then please check the link in the description or the link at the end of the video. What's up guys, so today we're going to be tackling PragerU for the second time, and probably not the last. But as per usual, before we get into that, let's go ahead and get right into the fan art section. First off, we have an incredibly excited Suris from Hema, Jack and Quill brings us a very androgynous Suris, and then a very happy Suris from Kitty. Thank you all for your fan art submissions, and let's go ahead and get right into the video.
Well, if socialism is nothing more than being kind to other people, then you might think the answer is yes.
Oh? Is this where the breadtubey stuff on my channel and the atheism stuff on my channel finally get to coalesce? Because that sounds like that's what's happening.
But you could be kind to other people and be a capitalist.
Oh. Yep, that's exactly what's happening here. That is 110% what's happening.
John D Rockefeller probably gave away more money than anyone in human history, and he was certainly a capitalist.
Yeah, which is something that would be expected when you have more wealth to throw around. You wouldn't expect an average Joe Schmo on the street that makes $40,000 a year to give away more than John D. Rockefeller.
Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have given away millions, too.
Yeah, same issue. When you can live off of less than 1% of your annual income, then it's definitely assumed that you would be able to actually give more money. This is why I don't see any issue with heavy taxing of someone who's incredibly rich. They have the means to absorb it without really suffering much damage, whereas a 50% tax on somebody who's living at the poverty line is a recipe for homelessness.
To get an accurate answer to our question, we need to define socialism. Socialism is the concentration of power into the hands of government elites to achieve the following purposes: central planning of the economy and the radical redistribution of wealth.
Okay, so you are aware that under taxation, the wealth is already redistributed, right? That's something that already exists in capitalist societies anyways.
Jesus never called for any of that. Nowhere in the New Testament does he advocate for the government to punish the rich or even to use tax money to help the poor. Nor does he promote the ideas of state ownership of businesses or central planning of the economy.
Alrighty, so we already have a bit of a problem. You're using possibly one of the most narrow definitions of socialism you can ever find. As a result, you get to say that Jesus doesn't fit all of these categories, therefore he could not be a socialist. But remember how in the beginning of the video that I could say I smelled the lack of nuance from here, based on the mere merit of it being a PragerU video? This is what I'm talking about. There are types of socialism that are inherently harmful, and there are types that are more benign, and there are types that work more as a graft onto pre-existing capitalist functions. For instance, New Zealand is not strictly a socialist country. However, most of their welfare policies are inherently socialistic. In the United States, we literally have a program called Social Security, a program that for some reason people have been trying to get rid of. But let me go ahead and run through a non-comprehensive list to show you exactly why this narrow view of socialism doesn't make any sense. Some communist ideologies include utopian socialism, Marxist communism, Marxist-Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, mutualism, collectivism, autonomism, democratic socialism, liberal socialism, ethical socialism, libertarian socialism. Oh, and here's a few: Christian socialism, Christian anarchism, and Islamic socialism. There's also things like green anarchism and sociocracy, but you get the picture. Trying to paint socialism as any one thing is almost nonsense. If we were to try to find a defining difference between capitalism and socialism, then it would basically just boil down to who owns the means of production. In socialism, the people own the means of production, and in capitalism, a capitalist owns the means of production. There are some forms of socialism where the state owns the means of production, or the government owns it, but there are just as many options for socialism that don't include the state doing anything like that, like, say, anarcho-syndicalism. In this version, the means of production is piloted by a series of trade unions. Think the Trade Federation in Star Wars, whereas the capitalists would have been the Munes, the international banking clan. But I'm starting to overcomplicate the video.
In Luke 12, Jesus is confronted by a man who wants him to redistribute wealth. "Master," the man says to Jesus, "tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replies, "Man, who made me a judge or divider over you?" And then he rebukes the man for being envious of his sibling.
That's not the same type of redistribution that you talked about earlier. You talked about government-sanctioned redistribution, whereas this has to do with a quabble over inheritance, a very individual issue. So I don't see how this is a good example for you.
How about Jesus' parable of the talents? Talents were a form of money in Jesus' day. A man entrusted 3 of his workers with his wealth. The 2 who invested the money and made a profit were praised, and the one who buried his share so he wouldn't lose any of it was reprimanded.
But hold on a minute. In the graphic that you just showed, he literally gave a smaller amount of wealth to one person, and the person with less wealth decided that they wanted to hold on to their money instead of investing it. That was uneven distribution. There's nothing inherently wrong with that on an individual basis, but reprimanding the person who had less for not investing as much as the people who had more, and therefore more means to invest, is basically the same thing as asking a standard Joe Schmo citizen to invest as much into charity as D Rockefeller did. It says nothing about the kindness of Rockefeller or the kindness of the Joe Schmo. It says everything about the means to which an individual had access to. And speaking of the D Rockefeller thing, let's go ahead and point out that in the United States, giving your wealth back into charity organizations is a tax break. It's not a measurement of personal kindness, it's literally a write-off to avoid being punished by the government.
Sounds a lot more like an endorsement for capitalism than socialism, doesn't it?
Except it couldn't be an endorsement for either of those things. Capitalism nor socialism had been introduced as economic principles until way after Jesus died. What you're doing is called a post hoc rationalization. You are trying to fit the teachings of Jesus into a modern model in your mind, even though the principles that were talked about in the parable of talents had nothing to do with that modern model. And even if they did, it seems to me that you're trying to make the assumption that there can be no investing under socialism, which, again, ignores all of the types of socialism where investment of wealth is literally a concept that is allowed for.
Yes, Jesus spoke of the difficulty for a rich man to enter heaven, but not because having money is evil. It's not money, rather it is the love of money, the New Testament tells us, that leads to evil. Jesus was warning us not to put acquisition of money and material possessions above our spiritual and moral lives.
Cool. And that is not an endorsement for capitalism in any way, shape, or form.
Was Jesus promoting a socialist model when he kicked the money changers out of the temple in Jerusalem? Again, the answer is no. Note the location where the incident occurred. It was in the holiest of places, God's house. Jesus was not angry at buying and selling in and of themselves. He was angry that these things happened in a house of prayer.
Okay, but even if that's the case, what is the point of bringing up that particular example to say that Jesus was somehow a socialist? If you really want to knock out some of the verses that people use to say that Jesus was a proponent of socialism, then why not go for something like Matthew 19:21? You know, the one where someone asks Jesus what he should do to be perfect, and Jesus responds that if you want to be perfect, go sell all of your possessions and then give to the poor. He then says that he will have treasure in heaven, and it will be treasure enough for him, and then to follow him. That one is literally about Jesus talking about people redistributing wealth, not when somebody's complaining to Jesus about an inheritance. You're cherry-picking parables.
He never drove a money changer from a marketplace or from a bank. Jesus advises us to be of generous spirit, to show kindness, to assist the widow and the orphan. But he clearly means this to be our responsibility, not the government's.
And whenever somebody tries to make a point like this, I always wonder if they realize that the government, especially in a system like the United States, is made up of people, individual people. Whereas in Jesus' time, there was a totalitarian structure, but again, this is PragerU, and nuance is lost on them.
Consider Jesus' Good Samaritan story. A traveler comes upon a man at the side of a road. The man had been beaten and robbed and left half dead. What did the traveler, the Good Samaritan, do? He helps the unfortunate man on the spot with his own resources. Ask yourself, to help the poor, would Jesus prefer that you give your money freely to the Salvation Army, for example, or have it taxed by politicians to fund a welfare bureaucracy?
I like how the examples you gave basically boiled down to, would you like to give to the righteous Salvation Army, or do you want to give to the evil government? let's put it this way. I would rather give that money through tax dollars to the government if they were willing to pay for things like socialized healthcare. And anyone that wants to argue against that has effectively just argued against a police force or even a firefighter squad, as these are also organizations that are primarily funded via tax dollars. Privatizing of healthcare has led to a crap ton of hikes in prices, and several incidents like EpiPens and insulin no longer being remotely accessible to the people who need them most. That price hike is a failure of the free market. So if we could somehow convince the government to work with a single-payer system, then I'd be a little more okay with that. And then, yeah, I would gladly pay my tax dollars into that. Your tax dollars also feed into the education system as well, but you guys aren't even a real university, so I don't know why you would care about that. On the side of righteousness, though, you have the Salvation Army, which has notoriously been homophobic, and in 2001 literally lobbied with the Bush administration to allow discriminatory hiring practices against homosexual individuals. They have since attempted to explain away their behavior as a method to remain competitive with other non-faith-based charities, but it is faith-based charities that are already given the most leeway in the United States anyways. Hell, on the topic of the Salvation Army, their track record is so bad they have an entire area on their website as an FAQ dealing with all of the alleged homophobia coming out of that organization. So in this instance, instead of giving that money to the Salvation Army, I would rather give that money in taxes and then have that money go to people who need it via either welfare programs, education programs, or even healthcare.
Progressives like to point out that Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." But that has absolutely nothing to do with high taxes or wealth redistribution. It was the seed for the idea of separating church and state.
Actually, no. The render unto Caesar thing was literally a response to someone asking whether or not it was lawful for Jews to pay taxes to Caesar. So while, yes, this actually does have a lot to do with separation of church and state, as in one's religious affiliation does not make them exempt from the state, it was still a direct response to someone inquiring about taxes. The only way you get to slip by on this is by saying it has absolutely nothing to do with high taxes, in which case you are technically correct. But only in the same way that a terms of service dodge makes you technically not in violation of terms of service.
It certainly wasn't the same as saying that whatever Caesar says is his must then be so, no matter how much he demands or what he intends to use it for. So there is no evidence that Jesus was a socialist.
Except for the passage in Matthew, where he literally tells somebody to redistribute their wealth. And again, only under your incredibly narrow view of what socialism is, when there are literally dozens of types of socialism that have and do exist. A couple of them very, very incredibly Christian. But leave it to PragerU to ignore nuance.
And there's lots of evidence that he supported free markets. In addition to the parable of the talents, Jesus offers his parable of the workers in the vineyard. In it, a landowner hires some laborers to pick grapes. Near the end of the day, he realizes he needs more workers to get the job done. To recruit them, he agrees to pay a full day's wage for just 1 hour of work. When one of the laborers who had worked an entire day complains, the landowner answers, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money?" That's a testament to the principles of supply and demand, of private property, and of voluntary contracts, not socialism.
So it is a bit of supply and demand, I will give that. But if anything, I would like to go ahead and twist this parable around to show you something that it could also mean. William Sloane Coffin actually has used this as an attempt to justify the principle of a living wage. Because in the parable, the workers are poor men, and they're working as temporary farmhands during a harvest. The employer realizes that they would need a full day's pay to feed their families. And given that the minimum wage for one person and one child has fallen well below the poverty line since the 80s, with one instance of popping above the poverty line and multiple instances of getting dangerously close to the point where a single person couldn't sustain themselves on minimum wage full time, it would seem to me that the more apt modern use of the parable is to justify a living wage, as opposed to justifying a single capitalist being able to exploit their workers.
Jesus never endorsed the forced redistribution of wealth.
Taxation is the forced redistribution of wealth. Jesus supported taxation when he said, "Render unto Caesar." Jesus did, in fact, support the redistribution of wealth, forced or otherwise, involuntarily through the render unto Caesar argument and voluntarily in the Matthew argument about giving to the poor to be perfect.
That idea is rooted in envy, something that he and the 10th of the Ten Commandments railed against. Most importantly, Jesus cared about helping the less fortunate. He never would have approved anything that undermines wealth creation.
Wealth creation does not invariably help the less fortunate. In fact, wealth creation has gone up in the United States in the last 30 years, while the minimum wage for workers has failed to meet their basic needs. The United States is a living, breathing example of how wealth creation by itself is not some fix-all tenet that makes the world a better place suddenly. It doesn't lift people out of poverty and suddenly make their lives better. For wealth growth to do that, there has to be a more nuanced discussion and a more nuanced use of that wealth. But again, this is PragerU, and nuance is something they're allergic to.
And the only thing that has ever created wealth and lifted masses of people out of poverty is free market capitalism.
Well, if you're going to argue that the United States version of capitalism has brought people out of poverty, like D Rockefeller, then you've already shot yourself in the foot, because there's just as many examples of people brought out of poverty in the United States as there are people who have been shoved into poverty because of just one medical bill or a student loan. But I don't even have to go that far to prove my point. The freest market economy in the world today, based on the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom, is Hong Kong. They rank as 90.2% economically free. By contrast, the United States ranks at about 78%. And what do we find in Hong Kong? Oh, 1 in 5 people live below the poverty line. Singapore is the second most economically free society in the world, and they too have a massive poverty issue. They have the largest economic gap in the world for income, and over 43% of their families have to be on economic assistance in order to even get by. These two are some of the most egregious examples of free markets literally forcing people into poverty. This is why you need socialized policies as band-aids in order to help out when the free market starts failing the proletariat. If you're going to make the absolute dumb shit argument that by mere merit of existing the free market lifts people out of poverty, then you're going to have to come with some facts and data and not just, hyperbole.
Read the New Testament. The plain meaning of the text is loud and clear. Jesus was not a socialist. He couldn't be. He loved people, not the state.
And the social programs that are usually pushed by non-free market socialists are about loving the people, not the state as well. If you're wondering why I sound so deadpan right now, it is because I am just that done with this PragerU video.
I'm Laurence Reed, president of the Foundation for Economic Education for Prager University.
And having someone like you, who has the least nuanced view on economics I have ever heard on the platform, literally teaching economics as a profession, confuses me and scares me. I would really prefer the United States not become, Hong Kong. Anywho, as usual, I will be providing some sources down below for you guys to read over, so I hope you guys enjoy. And while we might be able to agree that under the very strict, non-nuanced, and incredibly narrow version of socialism that they tried to define it as, Jesus was not that type of socialist, we can at least also agree that he was definitely not a free market capitalist. Oh, jeez. Anywho, insert end of video tagline here.